Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into a text that is, well, it's pretty foundational to understanding modern communication systems and power structures. Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky.
Right. And this book, it doesn't just offer an opinion. It asks this really profound structural question that gets right to the heart of what we do here. If the mass media operates within a system we celebrate, free market democracy, why is it that its output so often aligns, and I mean systematically and reliably, with the interests of state and corporate power?
Yeah, it really challenges that fundamental assumption that, if the government isn't actively censoring the news, then the press must be free.
It must be adversarial.
Exactly. And the relevance of this whole analysis, it's only gotten more intense since it was published. We live in a world that's just saturated with information.
More than ever.
More content than ever before, but at the same time, we're dealing with this accelerating inequality, both economic and political. So understanding how narratives get built and, more importantly, how they're constrained is, well, it's essential if you want to be a real participant in a democracy.
And that's precisely why our approach has to be systems-focused. We're not here to, point fingers and assign blame to individual journalists.
No, many of them are doing their best.
They are, within some serious constraints. Instead, we're doing a structural analysis. We're exploring the institutional design of the media marketplace to explain why the system produces these predictable, system-supportive results, no matter who is sitting in the reporter's chair.
Okay, so let's unpack the context of this landmark work. It first came out in 1988, and it brought together the expertise of two pretty different but equally influential thinkers.
Right. You have Edward S. Herman, who was a noted economist, a professor.
The political economy guy. The political economy guy. And then you have Noam Chomsky, who's known globally as a renowned linguist, a philosopher, and of course, a political activist.
And that pairing is so important, isn't it? An economist and a linguist.
It's crucial because it signals right away that this isn't just about language or political statements. They're looking at the underlying economic structure that decides which language and which statements get amplified and, which ones get buried.
And the timing, the late 80s, was deeply significant. They were responding to a media environment that was, well, it was rapidly centralizing.
Oh, massively. And it wasn't subtle. It was dramatic, and you could measure it. They cite data, particularly from people like Ben Bagdikian, that paints this really stark picture.
What were the numbers like?
Well, get this. In 1983, about 50 giant corporations dominated almost every kind of mass media in the U.S. 50.
Okay.
But by 1990, just 7 years later, that number had been cut by more than half, down to only 23 major firms.
23 firms controlling almost all the information for an entire country in less than a decade. That's staggering.
It is. And crucially, this happened with almost no opposition from U.S. administrations or regulators. It didn't matter if they were Republican or Democrat. This whole trend was accelerated by deregulation, which just, loosened the rules on ownership. The result is this intensified focus on the bottom line, where news becomes just another profit center.
Which leads us right to their central thesis, which they call, and it's a provocative name, the propaganda model. How did they actually define that idea?
They state that the mass media in the United States they're effective and powerful ideological institutions that carry out a system-supportive propaganda function. But the real genius of the model is explaining how it works in a society that's supposed to be free.
It's not the government sending memos.
No, not at all. There's no top-down coercion. Instead, it relies on three really subtle and powerful forces: market forces, internalized assumptions, and self-censorship.
So, the idea is that the whole system is designed so that information has to pass through these 5 filters before it gets to us. And if the information challenges the status quo in a fundamental way,
it gets filtered out.
Yep.
Exactly. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a theory of market dynamics. If a news organization doesn't play by these rules, it risks its economic life or political attacks or just becoming irrelevant. The outcome is compliance.
All right, let's dive into those 5 filters.
Yeah.
So the first filter they identify is, I guess, the most obvious one when you just look at the landscape: size, ownership, and profit orientation. We talked about the consolidation, but what does being a massive corporation actually do to a news division?
Well, it imposes this strong, uniform bottom line orientation that just affects every single choice. These dominant media firms, they're not public trusts, they're enormous businesses.
Right.
They're controlled by incredibly wealthy people or by managers who are constantly under pressure from shareholders, the market, and the need to maximize profit.
And it's not just about size, is it? The book really emphasizes how these firms are interlocked with other major corporations, banks, even the government.
Yeah, the shared financial interests are huge. They cite data from the late 80s showing companies like General Electric, which owned NBC back then, with assets around $35 billion. Capital Cities ABC was over $5 billion. I mean, in today's money, those numbers are just astronomical.
So what's the implication of all that interlocking?
The implication is pretty inescapable. When the people who own the media are structurally connected to the rest of the corporate and political establishment, I mean, they can't be expected to sustain content that fundamentally threatens that system.
It's just not in their interest.
It's not. Imagine you're running the news division for a $35 billion conglomerate. Your number one loyalty is to shareholder value. Journalism is just a product line, and that product line can't be allowed to undermine the parent company's other, much more profitable businesses, like, say, defense contracting.
So this filter just operates automatically. There's no memo needed. If a story is going to hurt the bottom line or expose systemic problems.
The structural pressure is just there. It's immediate. It's nonverbal. The story gets dropped or, sanitized. Plus, the sheer cost of entry into this market is so massive now, it restricts who can even play the game to begin with.
It basically ensures that only the wealthy can start a major media company.
Right, which just reinforces that elite orientation from the get-go.
Okay, moving on to the second filter. This one can be a little tricky because on the surface, it just seems like a normal part of business. The advertising license to do business. How does just needing ads become such a powerful filter?
Well, advertising is the lifeblood. For most mass media, especially newspapers or commercial TV, the money you pay for a subscription or what have you, it only covers a tiny fraction of the cost.
The rest is all ads.
The vast majority comes from advertisers. And that simple economic fact gives the advertising public, the companies paying the bills, a huge say in which programs or papers actually succeed and which ones fail.
So in other words, the media isn't selling a product, the news, to us, the public. It's selling us, the audience, to the advertisers.
Precisely. Advertising acts as a kind of a de facto licensing authority. If you don't have consistent, substantial support from advertisers, you just cease to be economically viable. It doesn't matter how popular you are with, say, a certain group of people.
And that's where the class element really kicks in, right?
Yeah.
Advertisers want to reach a specific demographic.
They want to reach people with disposable income who are ready to buy things. And this dynamic, historically, was what really weakened the working class press. A newspaper aimed at working class readers, even if it had great journalism, just didn't have the upscale audience that major advertisers wanted.
So they were starved of revenue and they died out.
They were, and that left the field open for media that caters to and promotes a consumerist, high-income worldview.
So the filter ensures the whole medium is biased towards a pro-market view, regardless of any single journalist's beliefs. The content has to create a buying mood.
Absolutely. Think about it. What kind of content makes you want to go shopping? It's generally light, it's entertaining, it's not confrontational, it's not a deep dive into complex issues that might challenge the foundations of the corporate system. And even non-commercial TV, which you'd think would escape this, is constantly under pressure. Because if it were actually well-funded and free from commercial influence, it would pose a real threat to the narrative control of the commercial media. So the pressure keeps it marginalized.
Let's talk about the third filter. Sourcing mass media news. This gets into the practical, the day-to-day mechanics of a newsroom. If money is tight, which is filter one,
Right.
You have to keep advertisers happy. Filter two, then you have to rely on sources that give you a lot of content for free.
And those primary sources are, almost without exception, huge government and corporate bureaucracies. These places have massive public information operations that give the media special, easy access. It creates this relationship of total dependence. The resource disparity is it's immense.
Yeah, can you put some numbers on that just to give a sense of the scale of this subsidy?
Sure. I mean, think about the state's information machine. In the late 70s, early 80s, the Pentagon was putting out something like 200 press releases a year, and that doesn't even count the hundreds of thousands of hometown news releases.
Wow.
Now compare that to a dissenting group like the National Council of Churches, the NCC, which might be critical of state policy.
What did their output look like?
The NCC's information office had a budget of maybe $350,000 a year, and they put out about 100 releases. So if you just look at the ratio of press releases from the U.S. Air Force alone versus groups like the NCC, you're talking about ratios of 150 to 1 or even like 2,000 to 1.
That is a tidal wave of information.
It's a tidal wave of authoritative, ready-to-use information that guarantees these powerful sources just dominate the news cycle.
So reporters rely on them because it's fast, it's cheap, and it sounds official. It's basically a massive financial subsidy to the media.
It is, and it dictates how you do your job. Journalists who play nice with sources in government and corporate HQs get rewarded with leaks and exclusives.
And journalists who challenge those sources.
They get cut off. They risk their careers. This leads to this systemic reliance on what they call authorized experts.
And that shows up on screen, doesn't it? The book looks at the guests on the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour back in the 80s.
Yeah, and it showed that 54% of the experts they had on were current or former government officials. The next biggest group, at almost 16%, was from conservative think tanks like the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS.
And just to be clear why that matters, CSIS is a well-known conservative establishment think tank. So if more than half your experts are from the government and a huge chunk of the rest are from organizations that support the government, you're not challenging the official view.
You're reinforcing it. It's a self-fulfilling loop. The media makes these people experts by quoting them all the time, which then makes them the obvious choice to quote next time, whether their analysis was right or not. It just keeps the whole debate locked within very narrow, acceptable boundaries.
So if those first three filters sort of build the fence around what's acceptable to talk about, the fourth filter is the security system that zaps anyone who tries to climb over it. Flak and the enforcers. Flak sounds organized.
It is. Flak is defined as negative responses or, coordinated efforts designed to discipline the media when it steps out of line. It's like an institutional immune system that attacks any deviation. This can be anything from orchestrated letter-writing campaigns, threats of lawsuits, political attacks.
So it's not just random people getting angry online. This is systemic, often funded by corporate interests, to basically raise the cost of doing critical journalism.
That's exactly it. These flak systems make sure that if a media outlet publishes something that's genuinely critical of a powerful institution, the Pentagon, a big corporation, an allied government, they're going to face this huge backlash. And that pressure, it just dramatically reinforces self-censorship. Editors and reporters learn very quickly which stories are too much trouble.
The book has this chilling example about the so-called Bulgarian connection in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that the KGB tried to assassinate the Pope.
Yeah, a network official basically admitted that if they wanted to put a critic of that theory on the air, they'd have to make sure that every I was dotted and crossed.
Impossibly high burden of proof.
Right. It would be a career-risking level of verification.
But what about the people pushing the approved narrative?
Oh, that was totally different. For people like Claire Sterling, a journalist whose work was heavily funded by places like Reader's Digest, the same official said there were no problems. She was allowed to go on air and transmit claims that were based on, literal falsehoods.
So that's the mechanism. If you challenge the consensus, you face paralyzing scrutiny.
Right.
If you repeat the consensus,
you get a license to be sloppy or even to lie because the institutional flak machines will stay silent for you. And it's incredibly effective in enforcing compliance.
Mm-hmm.
It explains why so many journalists just censor themselves. They know the path to career advancement is to stay within the lines.
Okay, that brings us to the fifth and final filter, which is more ideological. It sort of sets the moral framework for the entire system. Anti-communism as a control mechanism.
Right. Historically, anti-communism was like the dominant national religion. It was the lens through which everything was viewed, foreign and domestic. It was the moral justification for pretty much any intervention abroad, huge arms buildups, and the, obsessive focus on dissidents in enemy states like the Soviet Union.
And the power of this was that it constrained everyone, not just the right wing.
Exactly. It kept liberals constantly on the defensive, always afraid of being labeled as soft on communism. They were forced into positions that looked a lot like reactionary politics just to prove their loyalty.
The book talks about the military coup in Brazil in '64.
Which was enthusiastically supported by Kennedy liberals, all under this giant ideological umbrella of protecting the free world, or the overthrow of Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic. He was a populist who extended civil liberties to communists, and that was a line you just couldn't cross.
Okay, but the Soviet Union collapsed. The immediate communist threat went away. How did this filter adapt? How does it still function?
It doesn't disappear, it just evolves. It's modernized into this general, deeply embedded doctrine. The assumption that U.S. foreign policy is, at its core, moral and well-intentioned, no matter what the outcome is.
So U.S. aggression, invasions, bombings can only be framed as a tragedy or a blunder or an error.
But never as aggression.
Never.
That word, that characterization, is what Chomsky calls beyond the range of the thinkable in the mainstream. And this is what allows the media to maintain this high moral tone, this patriotic stance, even while it's functioning as a really effective propaganda system for state power.
Wow. Okay, so the ultimate and maybe the most devastating result of all these filters working together is this concept of the worthy and unworthy victim. This is where you see the bias manifest as just a gross double standard in human empathy.
Yes. The political selection of victims is really the litmus test for the whole system. When the media mobilizes huge amounts of attention, moral outrage, intense indignation, it's overwhelmingly focused on the victims of enemy states. Those are the worthy victims.
Because their suffering proves the enemy is evil and justifies whatever the U.S. wants to do.
Exactly. And the victims of the U.S. or its client states,
They're the unworthy victims.
their plight is ignored or minimized so that U.S. policies can just proceed without being burdened by public concern or moral questions.
Let's use the book's main examples to really show this. First, the murder of the Polish priest, Jerzy Popieluszko, in 1984.
Okay, so Popieluszko was murdered by state police in Poland, an enemy state in the Soviet bloc. The media coverage was immediate, it was massive, and it was designed to gin up outrage. The New York Times alone ran 78 articles, over 1,000 column inches. The coverage was full of rich, emotional detail. He was a worthy victim.
Now contrast that with the murders of Archbishop Oscar Romero and the 4 American churchwomen in El Salvador, a U.S. client state.
The contrast is just shocking. The U.S. was actively funding and supporting that regime. So first, the media downplayed or just suppressed the graphic details that would have caused outrage.
Like what?
While the initial press coverage didn't mention the bruises on the victims or the degrading use of the nun's underwear, even stuffing it into one victim's mouth, those are the kinds of details that were front and center in the Popieluszko case.
So by scrubbing the story of those emotionally powerful details, you minimize the political fallout.
You do. And that was paired with a narrative that protected the Salvadoran government. The media called it a reformist junta trying to control extremists of the right and the left. This was basically a lie. The terror was coming from the army and security forces that the U.S. was funding.
So it was damage limitation.
Total damage limitation. Blame was confined to a few low-level guardsmen so the U.S. aid could keep flowing. And unlike in the Polish case, where the media hunted for top-level involvement, here, the search for responsibility just stopped. The victims were unworthy because a real investigation would have undermined U.S. foreign policy.
And this pattern just repeats itself.
Over and over, the victims of Pol Pot in Cambodia were worthy until U.S. policy shifted to supporting him against Vietnam. Then the coverage changed.
And a really devastating modern example is the sanctions on Iraq after the first Gulf War.
This is maybe the most corrosive example. The U.S.-backed sanctions led directly to immense civilian suffering. UNICEF estimated that 500,000 children under 5 died in the 90s who wouldn't have otherwise.
And I remember Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, when she was asked about those deaths, said the price was worth it.
She did. And because those deaths resulted from U.S. policy, the model predicts exactly what happened. The media deemed the victims unworthy. Minimal attention, zero indignation, and words like genocide were just inapplicable. It's the political utility of the victim, not the scale of the atrocity, that determines the coverage.
Okay, let's shift from those cases to systems mapping and look at how these constraints play out in different political arenas, like elections, for example. The model would predict a pretty clear double standard.
A huge one. So in what they call sponsored elections, the ones held in U.S. client states like El Salvador or Guatemala in the 80s, the media's job is to legitimize the outcome no matter what.
Even with a backdrop of state terror.
Right. In Guatemala, something like 100,000 people had been killed by state forces. But the media can't talk about the lack of free speech or the climate of fear. They have to focus on the superficial stuff.
Like long voter lines.
Exactly. High turnout, long lines, and the reassurances of official observers who are, reliable supporters of U.S. policy. The basic conditions for a meaningful election were just completely off the agenda.
Okay, now let's flip it. What about a disfavored election, like in Nicaragua in 1984, which the U.S. opposed?
Here, the whole agenda reverses. The goal is to delegitimize the result, call it a farce. And the most blatant example was the completely staged MiG crisis that happened during election week.
Right. The administration claimed the Soviets were sending fighter jets to Nicaragua, and it dominated the news.
It was a classic PR op. The MiGs never existed, the claim was debunked later, but the timing was perfect. It broke right during election night coverage to distract from the fact that the Nicaraguan election was actually pretty successful.
And the media just ran with it.
They ran with it. No critical questions about the timing, about the false claim. They just followed the administration's script, shifting the whole conversation away from democracy in Nicaragua to this non-existent military threat. It's
Right.
a perfect illustration of the government setting the agenda and the media falling right in line.
You can really see Filter 5, the ideological one, at work in the Vietnam War retrospective. For years after the war, the dominant story was that the media lost the war by being too critical.
Right, which the model sees as a perfect example of flack. That narrative serves a vital purpose. It moves the debate away from the fundamental issue, which was the U.S. invasion of Vietnam itself.
By arguing about whether the media was too tough or too soft, you never have to ask if the U.S. had any right to be there at all.
Exactly. Even the harshest mainstream critics, the so-called doves, framed it as an excess of righteousness or a blunder.
But never addressed.
Never. That remains beyond the range of the thinkable. They accepted the core propaganda line that the U.S. was defending South Vietnam. Decades later, you still had people like President George Bush saying the Vietnamese had done things that might justify retribution, as if the U.S. has a unique right to self-defense anywhere in the world.
It's that unshakable doctrine of U.S. benevolence.
It is. And the funny thing is, the actual evidence about the Tet Offensive, which is always the prime example of adversarial media, shows the opposite.
How so?
The media was criticized for being too negative after Tet, but internal military assessments at the time, from guys like General Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, they were often more pessimistic than what the media was reporting.
So the media wasn't leading the charge. They were just reflecting disagreements that were already happening within the establishment.
Precisely. The media only really shifted its tone when key parts of the establishment, like the business community, started to decide the war was a bad investment. The whole media lost the war thing is just flack designed to keep the press in line.
It's so important to remember this isn't just about foreign policy. The propaganda model applies just as much to domestic policy, especially when public opinion is totally at odds with elite opinion.
Yeah, let's take two big issues from around the time the book was updated. NAFTA, the trade agreement, and the defense budget. Polls consistently showed a big majority of Americans opposed NAFTA.
Right.
And polls regularly showed people wanted a smaller defense budget with the money shifted to things like education and healthcare.
But the elite consensus was the exact opposite. So how does the media handle that huge gap?
It acts as a limiting agent. Since the corporations, the investors, and both political parties all agree on these issues, the debate in the media is just tightly controlled. They mostly ignored the public opposition to NAFTA, or they'd sort of suggest that the public was just uninformed.
A way to delegitimize the opposition.
It is, and I remember how they treated the labor unions who were fighting it. They were almost universally dismissed or attacked. Their actual concerns, job losses, worker rights were just excluded from the debate.
And alternative voices, like Ralph Nader, who wanted to cut the defense budget.
He was completely denied a voice in the dominant media. The system defines the boundaries of the debate, and anything outside of that is just made invisible.
We see that invisibility with the media and the chemical industry too, and this idea of the precautionary principle.
This is a really striking domestic application. Because of the power of the chemical industry, a huge advertiser and corporate player, the media has basically normalized a system where companies can sell chemicals and GMOs without any independent proof that they're safe.
It sounds like Rachel Carson's critique from decades ago.
It's the same framework. The media often adopts the industry's language, pushing for sound science over the precautionary principle. And we should probably unpack those terms.
Yeah, what's the difference?
Sound science, from the industry's point of view, means you need rigorous proof of harm for every single potential hazard, which sounds good, but it puts a huge burden on regulators or the public to prove something is dangerous, which can take decades. It slows regulation to a crawl.
And the precautionary principle.
That flips the burden of proof. It says if something is suspected of causing harm, the burden is on the company to prove it's safe before it's released. But the industry, with the media's help, has successfully framed that approach as anti-science or alarmist. And the media just systematically ignores evidence of industry fraud in its own safety testing, or the fact that agencies like the EPA are totally underfunded and captured by the industries they're supposed to regulate.
We've laid out how robust these filters are, but how have they adapted? I mean, since the book came out, we've had the rise of the internet. Let's talk about the present-day implications.
Right, the internet was a kind of dual challenge. On the one hand, yeah, it's a valuable tool for dissidents and for organizing. It's made networking more efficient. You saw that with protests against the WTO in Seattle.
The great equalizer, people hoped.
That was the hope. But the structural constraints of the model weren't just erased by fiber optic cables. The internet is not an instrument of mass communication if you don't already have a brand name, a big audience, or a lot of money.
The big players still dominate.
They overwhelmingly dominate the attention economy. The ability of centralized state and corporate power to shape the overall narrative is still heavily, heavily favored.
And this is all happening alongside another key modern factor, accelerating inequality.
Exactly. The economic gap that Herman and Chomsky wrote about has only gotten wider. The wealth of the top 1% has skyrocketed, while for the bottom 40%, it's stagnated or declined.
So the gap between what the public wants, like universal health care, and what the elite wants, like regressive tax cuts, has become this huge chasm.
An immense chasm. Which means the media's job to protect those elite interests from the demands of the public, what Alexander Hamilton called the great beast, that job has only gotten more necessary and more complex for them.
We really saw the result of that post 9/11 in the run-up to the Iraq War and the whole issue of Iraq's WMD.
Oh, that's a modern textbook case of the model working at peak efficiency. The mainstream media just systematically failed to examine the government's claims. They acted as reliable members of the war-making team.
Claims about aluminum tubes and biological toxins were just published as fact by outlets like the New York Times, even when they were being contradicted in real time by credible sources.
And that counter-evidence was just downplayed or ignored. UN inspectors like Hans Blix and Mohammed El-Baradei were contradicting the claims. Even high-level Iraqi defectors had said the WMD were destroyed years earlier. But the media gave more weight to anonymous administration officials than the inspectors on the ground.
The narrative was so set that the debate became how to invade, not if the threat was even real.
And the result was this shocking level of public ignorance. Polls showed half the country believed Iraq was tied to al-Qaeda and had WMD, both of which were false. That was high-efficiency war propaganda delivered without a single government order.
And we see that same pattern with threat inflation, like the demonization of Iran.
Yeah, take the case of Iran's President Ahmadinejad. He had a quote about the regime in Jerusalem vanishing from the page of Time, which was a common way of calling for regime change. But it was deliberately mistranslated and amplified in the West as a call to wipe Israel off the map.
And that mistranslation became a really handy tool.
It was reported in that inaccurate, fear-mongering way over 2,000 times. It served to massively inflate the threat from Iran, justifying sanctions and potential military action. And what's just as telling is what the media ignored at the same time. Major international statements from the non-aligned movement supporting Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy.
That was invisible, but the single mistranslated quote was everywhere. That is narrative control.
Okay.
Let's connect this all back to our broader mission here. What does the propaganda model teach us about the tension between systems and individuals?
I mean, it just constantly reinforces our central theme. The predictability of the outcomes, the worthy versus unworthy victims, the agenda setting, it all comes from the institutional design. It's not about reporters with malicious intent. They're often working inside a narrow framework, genuinely believing they're being objective. But the constraints of ownership, advertising, and sourcing force the system to produce these results.
So power isn't being exercised like in a dictatorship. It's power that's hidden in plain sight.
Absolutely. The model highlights power in neutral institutions. Power is exercised through market mechanisms, things that just seem like the way business is done. The media's ideological function emerges naturally from these commercial pressures, which makes it much harder to see, let alone challenge.
And in the end, that structural constraint shapes our entire perception of reality, of what's even possible to think about.
By consistently excluding alternative frameworks, by never questioning the core premise of U.S. benevolence, or by strictly limiting debate on issues where the elites agree, like the defense budget, the media achieves its ultimate goal of shaping perception. They mold our understanding of the world long before we even form an opinion on a specific policy. The result is a highly effective but mostly invisible manufacturing of consent.
This has been a a really deep and, frankly, pretty unnerving look at the mechanisms in manufacturing consent.
The core insight is just this revelation of the structural biases, economic, ideological incarnas that are inherent in the mass media. It explains the systematic patterns you see across the board.
So why does this perspective matter so much today for the health of our democracy?
Because the viability of a real democracy depends entirely on the integrity of its information flow. And the structural changes since 1988, more centralization, wider inequality, the digital attention economy, they've only made the model more efficient.
Yeah.
It forces you to realize that media freedom isn't a given just because there's no official government censor. Market forces can be just as powerful.
The analysis doesn't really offer easy solutions, does it? But it does leave us with a vital question to think about. How can democratic politics possibly thrive when our main sources of information are so centralized and constrained by these commercial incentives?
Right. Can the second superpower, public opinion, critical analysis online, grassroots organizing, can it overcome the structural dominance of the mainstream media to prevent more disasters? That's really the profound challenge we're facing.
Our deep dive today was based on the essential work Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky.
We encourage you to read the book yourself, support the authors if you found these ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini-explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.